right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our after hours class today. The topic is I'm the Floodplain Administrator, now what? My name is Erin Wendt. I am one of the outreach coordinators here at the state of Nebraska's Floodplain Management Division. I am joined with my colleague, Anna Christ. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Christ. I am also an outreach coordinator with the state, and will be helping covering some of this class today.
Yes, so we have both been with the state of Nebraska for almost 2 years now, and we are both certified floodplain managers. So we will get started. Okay, so a little agenda here for the class. We will start off with an introduction to the National Flood Insurance Program. Then we'll go into talking about the Floodplain Administrator role. Getting started is going to be some things that we recommend a floodplain administrator do once in their first couple of days or weeks getting acquainted with the position. Then we'll go into talking about the responsibilities of the floodplain administrator, and then we'll end off the class talking about some tips for success and resources that will help you be successful in the floodplain administrator role. All right, so that brings us to our first section here. So that's an introduction to the National Flood Insurance Program. So the National Flood Insurance Program, for those that may be unaware, it is a federal program that was established with the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. And this program enables property owners in participating communities the ability to purchase insurance as protection against flood losses. Typically, homeowners insurance policies don't cover flooding, so having this additional resource is very helpful for property owners. Participation in the National Flood Insurance Program is voluntary, and it is based on an agreement between the local communities and the federal government. So that agreement is that the federal government will make flood insurance available in participating communities that adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations to reduce flood risk to new floodplain development. This is just a little visual we like to show about the National Flood Insurance Program, kind of depicting it as a three-legged stool because each leg holds its own weight in the program and has importance. So the first thing we like to bring up is hazard identification in the National Flood Insurance Program. So this is going to be the mapping process, so delineating the floodplain boundaries so you know where your risk is. Flood mitigation is the regulations and your ordinances or resolutions that establish development standards in the floodplain. This is also any sort of mitigation projects to help reduce flood risk to maybe existing developments, as well as just flood protection as a whole. And the third leg of the National Flood Insurance Program is flood insurance. So this is financial protection from flood losses, because you can't always protect from every size of flood. So having that insurance available and encouraging your community members to maintain flood insurance will help them recover if a flood should occur in your community. So a few more basics to go into with the National Flood Insurance Program. So again, in order to obtain that federal flood insurance from the National Flood Insurance Program, your community has to be a participant. So in order to participate in the program, your community must adopt and implement floodplain management as a condition. So this requires the adoption and enforcement of a floodplain management ordinance. And the big one here is that any development in a floodplain has to have written permission or a permit to do so, to develop there. And this written permission to develop in the floodplain has to go through the floodplain administrator. That is one of their main roles. So a key word here is development. So in terms of floodplain management, development is defined as any man-made changes to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, drilling operations, or the storage of materials and equipment. So development is a wide range of things in the National Flood Insurance Program, and it's not just limited to structural development. It also includes non-structural development as well. So any kind of earthwork and that kind of thing. All right, so why do communities choose to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program? There are kind of four main reasons why communities join the National Flood Insurance Program, and a big one being flood insurance. Flood insurance is a requirement when a structure with a federally backed mortgage or loan is in an identified floodplain. And flood insurance can be really difficult to obtain through private insurers. So joining the National Flood Insurance Program guarantees that there is an option for your community members to obtain that flood insurance. There's also decreased liability when it comes to joining the National Flood Insurance Program because a requirement is regulating new development and reducing flood risk there. So having that active floodplain management program reduces risk to life and property to citizens in your community. Flood mitigation is also a big one. So it ties kind of in with that reducing risk to life and property. So mitigating flood damages before they occur means that your community can recover faster after an event. And that just increases your community's resiliency. And lastly, there's that federal disaster assistance. So communities that have identified floodplains, but are not a participant in the NFIP or are not taking steps to protect their current infrastructure or their future development may not qualify for certain forms of federal disaster assistance post-disaster. So being a participant in the NFIP shows that your community cares about protecting your future development, and the federal government takes that into account when determining federal disaster assistance. So those are the kind of the main points why communities tend to choose to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So we'll briefly talk about joining the National Flood Insurance Program. I'm sure most of you online right now are participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. You're likely the floodplain administrators for the communities, so you've already joined the program, but we'll just talk a little bit about how your community went about joining the program. So this includes 3 documents that have to be submitted. That's an application to join the program, a resolution of intent, and a floodplain management ordinance. This floodplain management ordinance will designate the floodplain administrator for your community. This is also where the community adopts floodplain management regulations. Now, the key point here is every community in the National Flood Insurance Program has a floodplain management ordinance. That was a requirement to join the program. So you have at least one from when you joined the program, if not maybe something more recent. If you can't find your floodplain management ordinance, feel free to contact us. We might have one in our files, or we can help you adopt a new floodplain management ordinance. All right, so now we will talk a little bit about the floodplain administrator position. So a floodplain administrator is the individual in a community tasked with implementing the floodplain management program. Again, this is an assigned title within the local ordinance. It can be designated to any recognized position within a community. This is often going to be the clerk, the zoning administrator, emergency manager, city planner, highway superintendent. It could be the board chairperson. Any already existing position in your local government is often designated as the floodplain administrator. It can also be contracted to an external person or group, but we more often see it as an already recognized position within the local government. Now, in the state of Nebraska, there are no minimum training requirements to be a floodplain administrator. So anybody in the local government can be designated as the floodplain administrator. All right, so more about the floodplain administrator. So the floodplain administrator acts as the community representative for all things floodplain related. So this is going to include things such as being the floodplain permitting official, the ordinance enforcement officer. You'll be the local contact for any citizens, community officials, and leadership to discuss any sort of floodplain issues. And you're our point of contact for floodplain mapping project updates, any sort of trainings we're providing, community compliance reviews, and any citizen complaints that may come our way. You're our first point of contact with that. So just keep that in mind as some of the roles you have. Now, on our website, we do have a community floodplain administrator information page here. And that's where contact information is maintained. If you go and look and contact information doesn't seem to be accurate for your community, let us know and we want to get that updated. But this is what the page of that website looks like. You've got that state of Nebraska there. And the different colors on the counties actually show the mapping project or the mapping status in the county. So that dark blue color is having countywide digital firms available or your flood insurance rate maps. The lighter blue color is where communities only have older paper maps available. And that gray color means that the community or the county doesn't have firms available countywide. So they're pretty unmapped or sparse. We're working to update the older paper maps in the community as well as get those unmapped areas mapped. That's part of our plan. So keep an eye out for that. And so those yellow hatched areas that you also see on the map, those are areas that we designate as having flood awareness areas. They're areas that are currently undergoing a mapping project. And so those flood awareness areas are there for informational purposes to show what the maps could look like in the future. So if your community happens to fall within one of those yellow hatched areas, we've likely reached out to you in the past or will be reaching out to you in the future about mapping project updates and attending some mapping meetings in the near future, potentially. All right, so moving right along into our next section about getting started. So you're a new floodplain administrator, you don't really know where to start. This will hopefully kind of walk you through some things you should take into consideration going into work in these next few days. So in the realm of floodplain management, there are a lot of acronyms and terms you're going to come across, and we've included some of these in the presentation as well, just because they're very common and you're going to see them a lot in this role. So some common acronyms you're going to come across are BFE, so that's the base flood elevation. A FIRM is your flood insurance rate map or your floodplain maps. The FIS is the flood insurance study. Those kind of go with the flood insurance rate map. The FPA is the floodplain administrator. We're mostly going to say floodplain administrator rather than FPA, but you'll see it written out as FPA throughout these slides. The NFIP is the National Flood Insurance Program, and the SFHA is the Special Flood Hazard Area or your floodplain. Now, the floodplain itself also has quite a few different names referring to the same area. So the 100-year floodplain, the 1% annual chance floodplain, the base floodplain, and the regulatory floodplain are all referring to the same thing. they're all referring to the floodplain or the flood that has a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. That's the floodplain or the standard in the National Flood Insurance Program to regulate to. So that's what we'll be focusing on with these classes and regulations and such. And that's what your local ordinance regulates to as well, to that 1% annual chance floodplain. Now with these acronyms, we'll also go more in depth on them later in this presentation, so just keep that in mind. So floodplains themselves, what are they? Well, the floodplain is any land area that is susceptible to being inundated by water from any source. This is an area that water naturally wants to go during high water events. Floodplains are natural. They've been here for as long as rivers have been here. It's where the water wants to go. So more specifically in terms of the National Flood Insurance Program and regulations is floodplains is the area that would be inundated during the 1% annual chance flood, the 100-year flood. Now, to give some context here, during a 30-year mortgage, a property has a 26% chance of being flooded if it's in the 1% annual chance floodplain. So it's a little higher risk than other locations would be. So that's again why flood insurance is important and why flood insurance is a mandatory purchase requirement if there is a federally backed mortgage or loan on a structure in the floodplain. So the special flood hazard area or the floodplain is where these National Flood Insurance Program and your local regulations apply and must be enforced. So this image here just kind of shows a little cross-section of what the floodplain looks like from the side. You can just see there's a lot of different terms and stuff and such. So the special flood hazard area encompasses all of it, but that also includes what's called the flood fringe, the regulatory floodway, and the stream channel. Base flood elevations are also associated with the special flood hazard area. And we'll go more in depth on all of these as well. We just wanted to provide this cross-section visual for you. Now, in terms of the maps themselves, they're typically shown as a zone or an area on a map. This particular image comes from our interactive floodplain map, which again, we'll go more in depth later in this presentation. And these floodplains are typically designated by our office. We have in-house mapping staff that work in partnership with FEMA to delineate these boundaries, but they are regulated at the local level by your local ordinance. Just for a little bit more context here, there are some other groups in the state of Nebraska that also have this partnership with FEMA to delineate floodplain boundaries. That includes the Papio, Missouri NRD and the City of Lincoln. They both have that partnership with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to map floodplains in their jurisdictions. All right, so some first steps to think about in your role as floodplain administrator if you're newly appointed, newly starting out. So we recommend that you start with becoming familiar with your floodplain boundaries. So you can use our interactive map on our website or the official FEMA firm panels or the flood insurance rate map panels to study the boundaries in your jurisdiction. We also recommend reviewing your community's floodplain regulations. So that includes, finding your ordinance, making sure it's up to date, and just getting a general idea of what needs to happen when development is proposed in your floodplain. We're not saying you have to have your regulations memorized, but just have a general understanding and know where to find your ordinance should something come up. We also recommend that you review any existing floodplain procedures already in place. So if your community has standard operating procedures in terms of how to go about permitting or enforcement procedures, we recommend that you review those, as well as determine the status of your community's permitting program. So are there other entities in your community that are responsible for other types of building permits? Do you have an established relationship with this person or this office responsible for that? And do you have a floodplain development permit application handy? Do you have one that you can reference and hand out to community members should they want to develop in your floodplain? Now, we are going to go much more in depth on each of these steps, and that is where Anna comes in.
All right. Yeah, like Erin said, we're going to break down these steps a little bit further, add some more information and some useful resources that you guys can have. So starting with step one, becoming familiar with your floodplain boundaries. This is something that is beneficial if you're a new floodplain administrator stepping into the role, or if you've been the floodplain administrator for so many years, just going back and reviewing your boundaries. If you've had any mapping updates recently that have maybe changed your floodplain boundaries, just staying up to date with that is going to be especially beneficial for your role. So on the next slide. So where you can find your floodplain boundaries, they are shown on what we mentioned before, your flood insurance rate maps or your firm panels. You can also find them digitally on our interactive map, which we'll show you how to get to later. They offer a little bit different viewpoint when looking at those boundaries, but you can access these on FEMA's Map Service Center. But the photo on the left is what a typical flood insurance rate map would look like. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner has a label that labels it as a firm panel, and it will have the corresponding ID number with that as well. The full right-hand side has a legend that kind of breaks down the different visuals on the map, identifying where your floodplain is, what type of zone it is, jurisdictional boundaries, things like that. But this is typically what it would look like. The floodplain is highlighted in the blue area. Some of them look a little different depending on what your firm maps look like, but that's the most basic version that we have. And also what you can find on FEMA's Map Service Center is your flood insurance study if your community has one. This is an enhanced study of your floodplains, typically for its AE zones. It's the engineered zones that are more studied than just your basic floodplains. But this goes along with your firm panels. So you can use this to determine base flood elevations, which is a responsibility of the floodplain administrator for zones that are engineered. But just it offers more detailed information about your floodplain mapping. So what we'll do next is kind of do a breakdown of how you find these things on FEMA's Map Service Center. So you can go to any search browser and type in FEMA MSC or FEMA's Map Service Center, and it should be the first link that pops up. If you click on that, it should take you to a welcome page that looks similar to what you're seeing on the screen. Once you get to that page, you'll want to click on the blue Search All Products, and it'll take you to a search page where you will want to insert your the state, your county, and then your community name, and then hit the blue search button on the bottom. This will take you to a results page. You might have to scroll down a little bit to get to your community's results. But here is where you'll find a bunch of information about your community's floodplains, including your firm panels and your flood insurance study. You can see you would have to click on the effective products folder, and that will drop down some more options. And that is where your firm panels and your flood insurance study will be listed. If you click on your firm panels button there, it will open up or drop down some more options. And each of those ID products in that table are your firm panels. You can kind of see the ID numbers are a little bit different on the third line of that table. That is the index, which incorporates all of the panels for the jurisdiction of that community. But the other ones are break down into individual panels. Now you can view the full panel on the end of that table. You can click the view button, or you can download them to your computer so that you have them saved and ready to look at whenever. So again, some people have difficulty, especially if you're looking for a specific project proposal or looking for a specific development within your floodplain. It can be a little bit difficult to read that on the firm panels. So another way to look at them is on our interactive map. It offers different imaging map layers to kind of make it easier when you're searching for developments or looking at specific properties. So we'll also do a breakdown of that as well. So our interactive map has a ton of different features. It shows your floodplain boundaries, your community's jurisdictions, including extraterritorial jurisdictions. We recommend going on to the interactive map and just looking at your community pretty frequently. And if there's any inconsistencies with your community's boundaries, if you've done any annexations or anything recently, let us know and we will go in and update the maps for you so you have the most accurate data available. You can also see firm panels if your community has any letters of map change that have gone through, and so much more is available on that. We do have a more extensive tutorial on how to use our interactive map recorded and on our website, and we will have an after hours class going over that as well in February. If we have some extra time in this class, we might do a live breakdown of some of the features on our interactive map as well. But how to find it? So if you search dwe.nebraska.gov, it will take you to this welcome screen. For those of you who don't know, the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources merged with the Department of Environment and Energy. And so we are still kind of working on combining our two websites together. But this is kind of the landing spot as of right now. So you can get to what would be the DNR legacy website by clicking the floodplain management picture, kind of the bottom left of the screen, or that yellow button will take you to the legacy website as well. Once you get to the legacy website, this is the welcome page for that. If you hover over that services section, it will bring a drop-down box with more options on where to navigate in the website. So over on the left is the floodplain management section. There's a bunch of different things that are available on our website. We'll kind of talk about that later as well. But at the very top of those options is the interactive maps. By clicking on that button, it'll take you to our interactive map page. And there you'll see our old interactive map, which is still usable. But we did just recently come out with our new updated interactive map. It has a new design, is hopefully more user-friendly, and just has additional features that are hopefully useful to you as the floodplain administrator. We're really urging people to use the new interactive map so you get more accustomed to the changes that are made before we take down the old one. And then also on that page, we have the real-time flood forecasting site, or the NERF tool. which again, we have an after hours class in February coming up, and then a recorded training video on our website that goes over all the features on our new interactive map and NERF as well. So when you are looking at your firm panels or your floodplain boundaries on the interactive map, there can be a ton of different things going on, different shadings, different patterns that dictate different types of floodplain. And those types of floodplains represent different flood risks. They're typically identified by letters and numbers. In Nebraska, you'll most often see regulatory floodplains identified by Zone A. You might see like Zone A-99 or Zone X. Some of these are regulatory floodplains, and some of them are just there to indicate some sort of flood risk. Your high flood risk areas would be identified as a Zone A, Zone AE, A1 through 30, or A99. And then your more moderate to low risk zones will be labeled as a shaded X, an unshaded Zone X, or a Zone B or C. And we'll kind of talk about that later as well. All right, so breaking down the different parts of the floodplain on a firm panel. So the Zone A is the flood hazard area that does not have base flood elevations available. That would be an area, if you needed to determine a base flood elevation, you can contact our office and we can help you get that for free. But it would be shown as a blue shaded area on the map. On this map, it does have an enhanced study. So the more solid blue shaded area is a Zone AE in the 1% annual chance floodplain, and this has base flood elevations available. You can use this firm panel along with your flood insurance study to determine the base flood elevation. And then the lighter shaded area in the middle of that blue zone that has the white dashed marks, that is the designated floodway predicted. As you can see, it can be kind of difficult to view that on the firm panel. So if you're having trouble determining different zones, use this along with the interactive map to kind of determine what you're looking at. And then on this one, they do have a shaded X zone, which is the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. This is depicted in the kind of black dotted shaded area. Now, in most cases, the 2% annual chance floodplain is not regulatory, meaning if you were to have a regular development pop up in this area, be proposed in this area, it may not require a floodplain development permit. There may not be regulations that are associated with that development, but it's good to know that there is some sort of risk of flooding when building in that area, especially knowing what kind of developments are going to be placed there. If you have any critical facilities, there may be some additional regulations that apply there. So it's good to know where that zone is on your maps. And then outside of that shaded X zone is the unshaded X zone, which shows the areas that are considered pretty low risk of flooding. So that is just the gray area outside of the floodplain boundaries there. On this picture, you can see cross sections that go across the floodplain. Those are determinations of the base flood elevation. And again, this is where you would utilize this along with your flood insurance study to make any BFE determinations. And again, it's important to note that not all firm panels look the same. Some of them have different shading, different features that are included in them. So it's important to review your firm panels and get familiar with those. So this is the same thing, but looking at a picture from our interactive map. So you can see it can be easier to look at different developments that are on the map just with the imaging layers that are available. And we try to set up the coloring so it's easier to differentiate the different zones and parts of your floodplain. So again, the A zone is, it would be depicted as the blue shaded area. That would be a flood zone that doesn't have any base flood elevations determined. On this image, the blue zone is a zone AE with the 1% annual chance floodplain and written base flood elevations. And then the floodplain is depicted as that red and blue striped area, or the floodway, sorry, is depicted as that red and blue striped area. The shaded X zone is that orangey yellow shaded area. And then the unshaded X zone would be the area outside of that with no shading. So next, another great thing to do when you are in the floodplain administrator position is reviewing your requirements for floodplain development. So these are all listed out in your local floodplain management ordinance. Again, if you aren't sure where that is, contact us and we will help you either find it or adopt a new one. This could be a standalone ordinance that you created maybe based off of our model, or it could be incorporated into larger zoning and building code documents. So if you're not sure where that is, do a little digging around, look in your zoning regulations or building codes, it might be incorporated in there. But the NFIP floodplain regulations are governed and enforced at the local level. All of the authority and everything that talks about your floodplain regulations, your enforcement authority, is in your floodplain ordinance. So if you are getting pushback from anybody in your community about the regulations you're trying to enforce, refer back to your ordinance and you can share that information with them, letting them know where that comes from. But your ordinance is the backbone of the Floodplain Administrator Authority. So at a very base level, the ordinance assigns the floodplain administrator position. So this is where you will have to list out the specific title of the individual who holds the floodplain administrator position. If that title changes for whatever reason, say the clerk was the floodplain administrator at first, but now it's moving over to the zoning administrator, you will need to amend your ordinance to reflect that change. And you can contact our office and we can help you do that. The ordinance also delegates the authority to the community and the floodplain administrator to run the floodplain program. It adopts your floodplain maps as a regulated area or zoning district, establishes building requirements for new structures or improvements on structures, as well as regulations for non-structural development, like we talked about before, which includes mining, filling, dredging, all of that. And then it identifies enforcement procedures and penalties for any violations within your community. So if you have a potential violation pop up in your community, refer back to your ordinance and it will give you steps on how to address that. All right. So again, all communities that are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program were required to have an ordinance when joining. So if you can't find it, contact us and we will help you find it or get a new one. Your floodplain ordinances were required to meet or exceed state and federal minimum standards. So these minimum standards for the state, they are listed out in the Nebraska Administrative Code, Chapter 455, or Title 455, Chapter 1. And then Nebraska Revised Statute, Chapter 31, Article 10 is what gives the local community the authority to enforce these regulations. The federal regulations are listed out in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44. And we'll kind of, on the next slide, we have an image that shows the development of that. All right, so this is just kind of a image to help show how these regulations are built upon. So the standards for floodplain management start at the federal level, and which establishes the national minimum standards. And then Nebraska adopted their own standards, which incorporate the federal minimum standards, but build upon that. So there are a couple higher standards for the state of Nebraska, which include prohibiting residential homes within the floodway, and the 1 foot freeboard requirement. Now, since these regulations are enforced at the local level, your community has the option to exceed even those standards. So you are required to adopt the state and federal minimum, but there are a ton of different higher standards or optional languages that you can incorporate into your ordinance to, based off of your flood risk, can help protect your community from your flood. So breaking this down a little bit more, your flood risk is shown at different regulation levels. So the level of regulation depends on the types of maps that are available in your community. If your community is unmapped, meaning you haven't had a mapping project go on, you don't have any paper maps or digital maps that show your floodplain boundaries, you would be a level A community. In this level, you would need to provide a floodplain development permit for any development within your jurisdiction, but the requirements for building and the requirements for issuing that permit are dependent on the best available data that you have. So flood history, if they're close to a waterway, things like that. Level B communities are communities that have just basic floodplain boundaries, so your zone A's that don't have any engineered studies or base flood elevations provided with that. All of the requirements for flood or for level A apply to level B, except that you're only regulating development that are within your floodplain boundaries. You also have level C, which isn't super common in Nebraska, but these are communities that have an engineered study or more information, more detailed maps. So they would have their zone AE, but do not have a floodplain or floodway designated within those maps. With level D, it's very similar to level C, except you have that designated floodway on your maps. And then level E, we don't have in Nebraska. Those are designated for coastal zones. All right, so this just breaks down based on the types of maps you have that designate what level of regulation you have. There's a corresponding ordinance that follows that. So we have model ordinances for each of these levels. If you are a level A community, you would adopt a level A ordinance. If you're a level B community, you adopt a level B ordinance. If you have mapping projects going on for your community, it's important to double check how your floodplains are changing. You may have to adopt a higher level ordinance to match the new information that you're receiving with those maps. All right. So, along with that, if you're not sure if your ordinance is compliant, reach out to our office. That is something we do pretty regularly, is review community ordinances to make sure they are compliant in meeting the minimum standards that are required. Um, if um, if you're going through that mapping update, we will review that ordinance as well, again, to make sure that there's nothing else that needs to be updated along with adopting those maps. And you can review those model ordinances on our website. They are available. We are coming out with an updated model ordinance. We are going through a pilot process right now, so hopefully that will be available soon. But we do have a couple trainings that go over the differences in that new model available. So updating your ordinance may be necessary if it doesn't adopt the current floodplain maps, if it's missing required regulations or definitions, or if it's more than 15 years old. There might be some missing sections that are required that may need to be included with that. So we'll kind of show what the ordinance adoption process looks like for Nebraska. So where it starts is you would go to your board and discuss updating your ordinance, and the board would agree on starting that process. You would review the model ordinance, choose to keep or remove any of the optional language or the higher standards, and this is where you would assign the floodplain administrator position. Once that draft is completed, you would submit it to us at the department for a review. We estimate this review take around 10 working days. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. But this review includes a cross-check with the state and federal minimum standards, just making sure everything is compliant. Once we're done with that review, we will provide you with any comments that include any missing language, incorrect firm panels reference, or anything that needs to be changed. And it'll be the community's responsibility to make those changes. Once that could happen multiple times, we could go back and forth. Once that is done and we have approved the drafted copy, we will send that over to FEMA for their final approval. Again, we estimate this take around 10 working days. Sometimes it's sooner, sometimes it takes a little longer. If FEMA comes back with any comments, we will work with you to get that resolved, make the required changes. And once we have that, the draft ordinance is got all of its final approvals. We will send the approved copy back to the community for adoption. We'll work with FEMA to get that updated on their end. And we just request a final signed and stamped copy of the adopted ordinance from you. So we have that for our records. So again, when you are going through any sort of mapping change, if you are a new floodplain administrator taking over the position and want to review your ordinance, that's the perfect time to consider adopting higher standards. Some examples of these include requiring the floodplain administrator to become a certified floodplain manager, adopting a higher freeboard requirement, prohibiting development in the floodway, or regulating critical facilities in the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. There are also some just optional standards that are not necessarily higher standards that make permitting a little bit easier for your community, depending on what types of development you have going on. But this would be wet floodproofing agriculture and accessory structures, or having a time limit for your permit viability. Just some different things that are available to think about what fits best for your community. So along with that, reviewing your existing procedures. So you should know what other groups in your community are responsible for permitting developments. Do permits go to your planning or zoning administrator, your building enforcement, or your community board? Any of those people who play a role in permitting developments, you should have a working relationship with them, so they know to check with you to see if a development is in the floodplain, so nothing gets missed. You should get to know the other individuals in your community and communicate where your role fits in, and what the requirements are for your community to stay compliant with the program. And then discuss strategies for communicating with leadership and other officials. We will get into that in some future slides and give you some tips on that as well. So in general, it's just important to make sure that you are involved in the permitting process. If you haven't already, make sure that you're reaching out to individuals in your community and making yourself known, making it known what your role and responsibilities are and what the requirements for floodplain development are. These proposals, if you have any development proposals show up in your community, they should come to you at some point prior to approval, as it's the floodplain administrator's job to approve these permits. You want to make sure that someone is checking the location of the floodplain in relation to the project, what type of flood zone the development is being proposed in, whether or not a floodplain permit is required, and then any additional permitting requirements for that type of development. The biggest point is you have to make sure somebody is checking on the floodplain before any sort of permit is issued. And then lastly, review or establish the floodplain permitting process. So it's important for you to know how your floodplain permitting process works for your community if you have some. If you want to go to the next slide, Erin. Perfect. So what are the procedures for reviewing proposals? Who's involved with that review process and the approval process? And then what information do you need to ask for? Knowing that process will help make things go a lot smoother when a proposal does come across your desk. If you don't have a process set up yet, we'll go over some tips a little bit later on. But feel free to talk to us. We're more than happy to help walk you through that, and let you know what procedures should look like in the future. We also recommend writing down your administrative procedures. So if you're not available for a time in the job, or if you pass the job on to somebody else, they have a better understanding of where to start for that role. So anytime you are processing a permit application, write down all the steps that you go through, write down the things that you're requiring for those permits. Just have that on hand for anybody else that might be working in this role. And then just going over what your floodplain development permit looks like. There's no requirement for what the permit has to look like. We do have a couple model permits that are available on our website under the digital desk reference that anybody is more than welcome to use or take as a starting point and alter to your community needs. But since everything is enforced at a local level, you can make your own floodplain development permit. You just want to make sure that it has a spot for the developer or the property owner contact information. You're collecting all of the information for the proposed development, and then all of the additional floodplain requirements that should be listed on that.
So next set here is we're going to talk about the floodplain administrator responsibilities. So there is a multitude of things the floodplain administrator is responsible for. So that's going to include things such as reviewing proposals to develop in the floodplain, issuing permits to develop or denying those proposals. You're also responsible for assuring that maintenance of the flood carrying capacity is maintained within the floodplain. So no unacceptable amounts of rise, that kind of thing. You're also responsible for determining the base flood elevation for proposals. You're responsible for working with us at the Nebraska Floodplain Management Division through audits. Those are also known as community assistance contacts or community assistance visits, and we'll go more in depth later on what those contacts and visits look like and entail. You're also responsible for ensuring that any sort of comprehensive plan within your community takes the floodplain into account, as well as following enforcement procedures when non-compliant work is being done in your floodplain. Your floodplain management ordinance will have enforcement procedures laid out. So again, that's another big reason why you should have that ordinance handy and ready, just so you can reference things when anything may come up. So those are the bulk of the floodplain administrator's responsibilities. You'll see that directly outlined in your floodplain management ordinance. However, there are some additional responsibilities that may not be as explicit as those, but they are still something that you need to take responsibility of. So a big one there is community engagement. As we made note of earlier, you are kind of the point of contact for community members to go to with anything floodplain related. So it's important that your community members know who you are and know how to contact you. We recommend having your permits and your ordinance publicly accessible for people to reference, as well as doing some kind of regular community outreach, such as sending mailers out to people who live in the floodplain with information related to permit requirements and development standards and so forth, and include your contact information so they can reach out if they have any questions. Another responsibility is leadership engagement. So you should be talking with your board on a regular basis or any governing body you have in the community, just so they are aware of who you are and know who to turn to in terms of floodplain management related stuff. Something that you can do with them is just review the ordinance at a board meeting. You can do that on a regular basis, just so they continue to be familiar with the regulations in there. If you would like, we can help come speak at a board meeting to kind of back you up and talk about floodplain management and the National Flood Insurance Program. You just have to reach out and let us know. And again, just update them on floodplain issues in the community. Another responsibility is revolving around times of disasters. So this is related to the substantial damage process specifically, which again, we'll talk more about substantial damage later in this presentation. This is just a brief overview at the moment, but that's going to include things such as post-damage inspection and issuing floodplain development permits for repairs. All right, so now we're going to talk specifically about permitting and a little bit about the permitting process, as that's one of the main roles of the floodplain administrator. So remember, all development in the floodplain or the special flood hazard area must receive written permission or a floodplain development permit before they start work in the floodplain. And again, the definition for development is on the screen there. I'm not going to read it out to you guys again because it is quite long, but just remember to keep in mind that it includes buildings and structures, any kind of earthwork, and also the storage of materials and equipment is considered development. So anything that falls within the realm of what's listed in that definition there, but there are also, obviously, it's not limited to just that, is going to need a floodplain development permit. So why is the permitting process necessary? Well, it's a condition of National Flood Insurance Program participation. It's also outlined in state and federal law that development in your floodplain as a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program requires a floodplain development permit. Having this permitting process in place also improves community resiliency because by getting these permits prior to starting work or development, your community members and property owners and your developers know how to build this new development in a safe manner, in a way that's reasonably safe from flooding. These are also required documents for any community assistance contact or community assistance visit we might have with you. So this is just to ensure your permitting process is in place. You need these documents. And a big one is that unpermitted developments in your floodplain or your special flood hazard area are considered violations. And unresolved violations can lead to probation and or suspension from the National Flood Insurance Program. So probation is a change in your community status where any existing policies in your community will have a $50 surcharge on their premiums for the period of at least 1 year, but maybe extended. And if the violations continue to be unresolved, it could lead to suspension, which is essentially removal from the program. Flood insurance will no longer be available to your community members if you are suspended from the program. So no new flood insurance policies can be purchased or renewed. And disaster assistance may become unavailable in certain instances if you become suspended from the program. So ensuring you have a proper and robust permitting process is necessary to maintain good status in the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, when it comes to the unpermitted developments with probation and suspension, I know it sounds big and scary, but as long as you are working with us at the state, we're not going to tell FEMA, as long as you are making good faith efforts to resolve those violations and you are in constant communication with us, you will stay in good standing as long as you are trying to resolve those violations and then eventually work towards a violation. It's when we get to the point where you're not making any efforts anymore, where we'll have to bring FEMA in, which may result to probation and suspension. Now, for more information on the permitting process, we did just recently have a 2-part permitting process class, and those are on our YouTube channel and our trainings webpage if you want even more information than what we're going to go into today. This is just going to be kind of a brief overview of the permitting process. So again, if you want more detailed information, visit those other trainings that we have. All right, so broad overview of the permitting process. So step 1 of the floodplain development permitting process is determining whether or not the proposed development is in a regulated floodplain. So if it is not located in a regulated floodplain, a floodplain development permit is not required. Now, your community may have other local building permits that it needs, but it won't need a floodplain development permit, so you can stop here. However, if it is in a floodplain, it will need a floodplain development permit. This is where we continue to the next step. So the next step is having the property owner or developer complete the floodplain development permit application form. This can be a little tricky for some property owners or developers to fill out, so they may have questions. Assistance may be needed, so be prepared for some questions. We do have a instruction page if you're using our model template, and that can maybe help them fill out the required portions on their end. So just make sure to have that handy as well if you're using our model permit. Step 3 is the floodplain administrator will review the permit application for completeness and correction. So when you're reviewing that permit application that the property owner or developer returns to you, if any information seems to be missing or is incorrect, do not approve the permit, and don't approve the permit on the promise that they'll fix the information. What you'll want to do in this situation is return the permit application form to them with what's called a request for information form. So again, we have a template request for information form you can use. And so on this, you would fill out the information that identifies the permit that you are working through, as well as marking or adding any comments of what you need more information on, what kind of submittal documents you might need, or more specific site location, that kind of thing. Now, again, if you are unsure of any sort of the information that they've provided to you, we can help you review permits and submittal documents if you would like. You just have to reach out to us. We aren't an enforcement or permitting authority, so we can't tell you whether to approve or deny the permit, but we can provide comments and guidance on what you should ask for. All right, step 4 is approving or denying the permit. So this will, if approving the permit, this is going to involve filling out certain portions that the floodplain administrator is responsible for. This is in the context of using our model permits. But the floodplain administrator will be responsible for filling out information related to the base flood elevation determination and the required flood protection elevation. So we'll go more in depth on where to find the base flood elevation, but just a quick note here is that the required flood protection elevation at a minimum is going to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation, as that is Nebraska's minimum standard. Your community may have a higher standard adopted where you elevate higher than 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So again, just reference your local ordinance to see what regulations apply to your community. This section is also going to be where the flood zone is designated. So if it's an A zone, an AE zone, or the floodway, any sort of regulatory requirements. So if it's a structure, it's going to depend on, are they going to elevate or floodproof, depending on the use of the structure. If this permit is associated with an existing structure in your community, there is a section that determines whether or not it's considered a substantial improvement. And again, we'll talk about substantial improvement in just a little bit. This is also going to outline post-construction requirements. So any sort of compliance documentation that is needed. This is going to depend on the type of development and the use of the structure. So if you have any questions, if a permit or compliance documentation comes across your desk and you're not sure if they've given you everything that you need, you can reach out to us and we can point you in the right direction. And lastly, of course, this is where you will notate any of the required submittal documents and just ensure that they've provided everything to you. These required submittal documents, again, are going to be dependent on the type of development and use of a structure. So again, any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. So again, with approving or denying the permit, there is a small box at the end of the permit application form where you will notate whether the permit is approved, the permit is denied, or if you are requesting additional information, and that goes back to the previous step with that request for information form. Now, if the permit is approved, you will sign and date the permit as well as providing a permit expiration date. So that permit expiration date ties in with step 5 here. So step 5 is when the project begins construction. So construction of the development, work for the development has to begin within 180 days of permit issuance. Now, the actual work being done may take longer than 180 days, but the start of that construction has to be within that 180 days or the permit expires and a new application is required. That's just to ensure that the property owners and developers get a move on with developing and doing their project, and that information that you provided them does not become outdated because they waited 3 years to start the project. So this is just to ensure that they are working on the best available data at the time. All right, step 6 is proof of compliance. So like I said, again, proof of compliance is going to be very dependent on the type of development that was permitted and if it's a structure, the use of the structure. So this is typically going to include things such as elevation certificates or surveyed elevations of the lowest floor if it's a structure. Floodproofing certificates may be acceptable if it's a non-residential structure. Any kind of earthwork or development compliance documentation might include photographs or updated grading plans, the elevations and such. It's, again, just going to be very dependent on the type of development. So if you have any questions as to what is required for proof of compliance for a certain type of development, reach out to us and we can provide guidance on that. All right, like I said, we are going to move right along into base flood elevation determinations. So that is one of the roles of the floodplain administrator, is determining the base flood elevation for property owners or developers so they can know what they need to build to if they're putting in a structure of some kind. So base flood elevation determinations can come from 3 different places. So if a development is occurring in an AO or an AH zone, those elevations are going to be found on the flood insurance rate map panel. These are the only 2 zones where the BFE can come from. So any other zone has to come from either our office or the flood insurance study. So our office can help with base flood elevation determinations in basic zone A studies. So if you're a community that doesn't have that enhanced study done in your floodplains, but you know development is going to occur, you can request from our office a base flood elevation determination map, and we'll go more in depth on that in the next slide. Lastly, if you have AE zones in your floodplain, this is where the flood insurance study comes in. There are study profiles and charts and stuff in that flood insurance study that you can use to determine the base flood elevation as the floodplain administrator. Now, base flood elevations determinations using the flood insurance study can be a little tricky. We do have a couple of different trainings on our website that go into how to determine the base flood elevation using a flood insurance study. So I would recommend you check out our permitting with confidence class, the permitting process part 2, or attend one of our basic floodplain management classes. In each of those, we will or have gone over the steps to determine a base flood elevation using the flood insurance study. So you can reference those if needed. Now, many of the communities in Nebraska have just the basic zone A studies where base flood elevations have not been determined, so you can't use a flood insurance study to figure that out. So that's where we come in. Floodplain administrators have the option to request these base flood elevation determination maps from our website, and we can help with the permitting process there. So you'll have this first page here with the actual map, and then there's a second page of just some information on uses and stuff, and we'll go more in depth on this page in just a couple of slides. So when it comes to requesting a base flood elevation determination map from our office, it is a free service offered by us. Our in-house mapping staff, this is one of their tasks to help with. This is only for basic zone A studies, basic zone A floodplains. So if you are trying to request this kind of map for an AE zone or an AO or AH zone, we unfortunately can't do that. And that is where either the firm panel is used or the flood insurance study is used. Now, this is something that can only be requested by the floodplain administrator. So you would just go to our website, and this is a screenshot of that page right there where you would select the request a BFE determination. It does require you to log in to make that request. If you are unsure of your login credentials, reach out to Michelle York and she can help you figure out the login information there for you. Typical turnaround is around 2 weeks. It may take a little bit longer depending on the demand our office has. So just keep that in mind. It'll take a couple of weeks to get that determination map around. And these determination maps are typically valid for about 5 years or until we supersede them with new data. So these aren't something that you can use indefinitely. They are within a certain window, as that's the best available data window there. And so again, base flood elevations may change between determination requests. This can be due to updated LiDAR, model data, developments that have happened upstream. You've received new floodplain maps. So that's why it's important that you don't print these maps and use them indefinitely. That's why they've got that lifespan of about 5 years. These can be used for permitting, letters of map change, or helping with elevation certificates. And there are some limitations when using this BFE determination map as well in zone A's. So they can't be used for any sort of hydraulic structure, so no levees, berms, dams, that kind of thing. They can't be used for any subdivisions or any other developments that are greater than 5 acres or 50 lots. That is just too large for our office to accommodate. So if you have any developments like that occurring, they need to get site-specific data from an engineering firm. One thing to note as well, I'll have to go back a couple slides here, but you can see on this map, we've got those black lines across the floodplain. If a proposed development falls in between 2 of those lines, you want to use the higher of the 2 elevation numbers. You want to go to the next whole number on the map. Interpolation between those lines in a zone A floodplain is not allowed. You just have to use the next whole number. So keep that in mind.
All right. So I will talk a little bit about the community assistance contacts and community assistance visits. Like Erin mentioned before, they are a part of the floodplain administrator's responsibilities, and all of the responsibilities that Erin just covered apply towards these contacts. So we will start off with the community assistance contact. So these are short visits with the floodplain administrator. Any other community officials that want to attend are welcome, and our outreach team. We conduct these with Nebraska communities approximately every 5 years. So if you have just recently had one with us, you probably have some time before you see us again. If you haven't had one in a while, we'll probably be in touch with you to get one scheduled. They are, again, pretty short meetings. They take approximately 30 minutes to an hour long, depending on how much development you have going on in your community or just different things you want to talk about. We conduct these typically over phone call or over a Zoom meeting, whichever works best for your community. We do sometimes have the opportunity to do them in person. So if that is necessary for your community, just work with us and we can get something figured out. But during these meetings, we are just going over your community's floodplain program. We'll go over the roles and responsibilities of the floodplain administrator in case you're a new floodplain administrator or just need a refresher. Just making sure you have a good handle on your role. We'll go over your community's permitting process, seeing if there's anything that should be updated or altered with that. Before the meeting, we'll do a review of your ordinance to make sure that it's compliant. If it does need any sort of updating, if you need a new ordinance or just to amend some small things, that will be a condition of closing out the contact. And then we'll go over just your general administrative procedures with floodplain management. Again, seeing if there's anything that could use some updating, if you have any questions on what you should be doing for these procedures. It's just a discussion to go over that. It's a chance for us to get in contact with you so you know who you're working with on the other side, and it's a chance for you to ask questions. It's intended to make sure that the community is compliant with the National Flood Insurance Program and just fix anything that might be putting a riff in your floodplain management program. And then also to share resources. We are always trying to work on new resources and tools that will help you do your job easier. So if there's anything that new that we've come out with, or if there's any recommendations of things that you'd like to see, this would be a time to share that. But as the floodplain administrator, it is your responsibility to work with our team to close out that contact. We like to get those closed out as quickly as possible, so there's not anything left unresolved. So something similar to that is the community assistant visits. These are a little bit more extensive. They are an in-person meeting. So we will get in contact with your community well before a meeting takes place. Just kind of going over the process, what we are going to be expecting, what you can expect from the process. We will give you a list of pre-selected sites. These are typically new developments within your community. And on the day of the meeting, we'll go around and do a tour of these pre-selected sites. You as a floodplain administrator are more than welcome to come along with us on that tour. So you can kind of talk to us about the development and everything that went on. After the tour, we'll go back to an office or a meeting site and have a sit-down visit, again, with you as the floodplain administrator, or if there's any other community officials that would like to attend, they're more than welcome to attend as well. But it's just going to be a discussion about those sites. We're going to review the documents that were submitted for those sites. So the floodplain development permit, if there were any post-construction documents that were required, we'll go over that. So you'll want to make sure that you have all of that ready before the meeting. And then again, just work with us to close out the open items for that visit. It is an audit, so there is a set time frame that these will have to be brought into compliance or closed out. You have an initial 90 days after the meeting to start giving us the documents that we went over, bringing things into compliance as needed. There is some leeway as long as you are continuing to work on the open items and communicating with us to extend that deadline. But you want to make sure that you're keeping us in the loop and working with us. These meetings are not intended to find violations in your community or call you out on anything. They're a way just to make sure that your floodplain management program is working well and to answer any questions, provide any assistance that we can. All right. So an additional responsibility of the floodplain administrator, like we've talked about, is community and leadership engagement. With these slides, we'll kind of give you some tips on things you can do to kind of improve that relationship within your community. So for community engagement, floodplain management regulations are not necessarily well known with the public, but it doesn't have to be that way. It will make your job as the floodplain administrator a lot easier if people are aware of the regulations that they need to follow and who they need to contact when things in the floodplain pop up. So you should take it upon yourself to inform your community property owners, your leadership, any realtors, surveyors, contractors, or builders that work within your community's jurisdiction. Build a network and a relationship with them as well. And then your local emergency management. Just having that network so you have that open line of communication will help kind of close the gap between that. For property owners specifically, there are a couple ways that you can kind of build that relationship. Distributing messages through annual mailers, hosting community meetings, press releases, posting social media messages, any other ideas that you have. Just getting your contact information out there, letting people know that they are located in a floodplain. Just spreading that information is going to be extremely valuable. This information should be easily accessible to the public. So posting information wherever you can or placing high water marks in your community is a great way to do that. Building these connections with your property owners can help reduce violations if people are aware of floodplain regulations. Hopefully, you can prevent any violations before they occur. It helps encourage safe development and the purchase of flood insurance. We may have mentioned you don't have to be located within a floodplain to purchase flood insurance. If the community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, anybody within the community has access to flood insurance. So posting that, making sure that is known to your community members is extremely important. And then working with your leadership, as the floodplain administrator, there can be some difficult decisions that have to be made, and sometimes your community members aren't happy with some of those decisions. So it's important that you have support from your community leadership to help enforce your regulations. If you can occasionally speak at community meetings to discuss what the National Flood Insurance Program is and the benefits of the program, show your leadership your floodplain boundaries. So if anything comes across their desk, they know to talk with you. Share what your roles and responsibilities are, and share your floodplain management regulations. And by doing this, you can also discuss your floodplain management ordinance and consider updating with higher standards. Again, it's all with the purpose of better protecting your community to reduce any loss of life or property. With that, some things that are a great benefit for higher standards with new constructions that you can bring up when proposing to your board. A higher freeboard is the #1 way to reduce flood damages when you're constructing structures in the floodway. 1 foot of freeboard adds only 0.25 or to 1.5% to the total construction cost for a new building. So in the grand scheme of things, not that much extra to build safer from flooding. Communities can save around $7 for every $1 spent on resilience. Property owners save around 20% per year on flood insurance costs with 1 foot of freeboard. And costs for additional freeboard will pay for itself within the first 5 to 10 years of the structure's lifetime through reduced damages and flood insurance. So overall, it can be more cost effective to build safer from flooding in the first place rather than dealing with damages later on.
All right, so now we are going to talk a bit about post-disaster responsibilities. So this is where that substantial damage and improvement information or responsibility comes into play here. So again, repairs or additions to structures in the floodplain are considered development, and so they must be permitted by the community. This is typically relatively easy to do so if the structure is already compliant with your local regulations. However, what happens when the structure needs repaired or improved, but it's currently grandfathered? It's a non-conforming structure that existed before you had these floodplain management regulations adopted. So these next few slides are going to talk about what that process looks like for these existing structures. So if a non-conforming or existing structure is substantially damaged or substantially improved, it has to be brought into compliance with your local floodplain management regulations. That substantial definition considers it as new development, and new development has to follow your local regulations. So therefore, when a disaster occurs in terms of substantial damage, the floodplain administrator and the local community is responsible for determining if these structures have incurred substantial damage before issuing permits to repair that structure. This is what's called a substantial damage assessment. So in terms of substantial damage and substantial improvement, this is established as when repairs or improvements to the structure are going to equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure. Now, in the National Flood Insurance Program, 50% is the minimum standard for that percentage threshold. Local communities can adopt a lower percentage threshold as a higher standard. So you can go down to 40%, 30%, whatever you so choose. That is a higher standard that your community can adopt. So make sure you reference your ordinance to make sure you know what that's at. Communities can also adopt language for cumulative cost tracking. So at a minimum, most of these substantial damage determinations and assessments are going to be on a event basis or a permit basis. But communities can adopt language for cumulative cost tracking. So you keep track of these required repairs or improvements over a certain amount of time. And once the total of each of those events equals that percentage threshold you've adopted, then in that last event, they'll have to bring their structure into compliance with your local regulations, even if that specific event itself was less than 50%. So again, please check your local floodplain ordinance for your community's expectations if you have that lower percentage threshold or if you have that cumulative cost tracking language. And again, any questions related to substantial damage or improvement, please feel free to reach out to us. We can help with any of that. So this is just a little visual of the calculation that goes into play when determining if a structure is substantially damaged or improved. So you'll take the cost to repair the structure to its pre-damage condition or the cost of the improvement work, divide it by either the pre-damaged market value of the structure or the current market value, depending on if it's a substantial damage or a substantial improvement determination. And then you'll multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. So, for example, if the repair or improvement cost is $25,000 and the market value of the structure is $250,000, that would equate to 10%. So the work costs 10% of the value of the structure. So it would not be considered substantial damage or substantial improvement in this situation. Now, some things to keep in mind. There are some required included costs when taking that repair work or improvement cost when making that determination. So that's going to include things such as the market rate of materials and labor. Even if this is going to be volunteered or free from the property owner, you still have to calculate it as if it is being done professionally. This also includes demolition costs and labor costs, any contractor overhead or profit. All structural elements need to be taken into account. So that's going to be the exterior finish, flooring, cabinets, electrical and utilities, that kind of thing. And any sort of built-in appliances also have to be included in that cost determination. Now, there are some excluded costs that you don't have to take into account when determining substantial damage or substantial improvement. So that's going to be things like trash removal and cleanup, any sort of temporary stabilization of the structure, survey or engineer costs, permit or inspection fees, any plug-in appliances, or any correction of health, safety, or sanitary code violations. Those are all things that can be excluded from your cost determination. Now, the substantial damage process is typically broken down into 6 steps here that you see on the screen. This is also included in our substantial damage handbook that you can find on our digital desk reference. So as you can see here, it's laid out pretty detailed, and our handbook is a great resource to learn about the substantial damage process and your roles and responsibilities as the floodplain administrator in a post-disaster situation. We also have a bunch of other kinds of resources related to substantial damage on our digital desk reference and on our trainings webpage. So if you want more information on the substantial damage process and your roles and responsibilities as a floodplain administrator in these kinds of situations, we highly recommend that you watch our recorded training titled Before and After Disaster Strikes, Substantial Damage 101. This is a super in-depth training on substantial damage, so it will help you prepare for this kind of situation. And again, we are here to help. If you have any questions related to substantial damage, or if you need any assistance conducting substantial damage or substantial improvement calculations, reach out to us and we can help you with that.
All right, so just to finish up, I'll go over kind of just a review of all the tips that we went over throughout this presentation and some helpful resources to go along with that. So again, the biggest tip that we can give is to network with individuals in your community, your permitting officials, property owners. Build that network within your community so you have that working relationship. It's also recommended to network with other floodplain administrators in your area. Like we showed before, you can go to our website and search up floodplain administrator contact information. So if you have a development that is close to the boundaries of your jurisdiction, maybe it's crossing over multiple jurisdictions, you can contact the other floodplain administrators in that area and cover all your bases. You can ask questions if you're not sure how to handle a situation and you don't want to come to us yet. That is an extremely valuable resource with other people that are in the same shoes as you. Ensure your local contractors and surveyors know who you are. So if they have a project that comes to them that is located in the floodplain, they know who to contact. So you get that permit issued before any development occurs. And then, of course, attend any of our floodplain management trainings. We have a ton of those that happen on a monthly basis. We have a ton of recorded trainings on our website if you ever need a refresher. If there are any topics that we haven't covered that you'd like for us to do, let us know, and we can work that into our schedule as well. And again, ensure that your contact information is easily accessible. Any floodplain information, post that for your community to see. Education will be your biggest tool in this role. Post it on websites, high traffic community buildings, offices, or other permitting official offices. Put that information out there so that people know where to find it or where to find you. You can create or post promotional materials. We have a ton of materials on our website under our digital desk reference that anybody is free to use. You can take that right off our website, print it off, and post it in your office or other places. Follow us on social media so you can see those informational posts and you can share those with your community. If you are interested in creating your own promotional materials and would like us to review them before you send those out, we can do that as well. And making sure that you're speaking to your community leadership often to make sure they have an understanding of what the requirements are and what your role is and are able to back you up. And again, we are typically able to go to community board meetings if you need additional support and there are any questions that need to be answered. And then this is just a review of the resources that we talked about in this presentation. Again, there's a ton of information on our digital desk reference that is available to you. Our interactive map to view your floodplains. You're able to request base flood elevation determinations. We have an insurance page that goes over flood insurance resources, the Floodplain Administrator search, and then the FEMA Map Service Center to view your firm panels. And then just a breakdown of some of the information that can be found on our digital desk reference. We have our model floodplain ordinances that you can review, our model development permits that you can take and use. With those, we have instructions on how to use those permits, and then a place to request a form to request more information from the developer or the property owner. We have different technical bulletins from FEMA that describe how to build reasonably safe from flooding in the floodplain for different types of development. We have a ton of just general National Flood Insurance Program resources that are available to you. Information on post-disaster processes. We have the Substantial Damage Handbook, different forms and templates. We have our Infield Quick Guide to help you with substantial damage determinations, things like that. And then if you are new to the floodplain administrator role, we have the welcome guide for new floodplain administrators that just has a basic breakdown of the National Flood Insurance Program and your role as the floodplain administrator.
All right, so just to wrap things up here, we do have some upcoming trainings we'd like to advertise. So next month on November 18th from 1 to 2 p.m., we will have a class specific on higher floodplain standards. So going beyond the minimums. So what are some things you can do to adopt in your ordinance to protect your community even further? And then we also have our virtual basic floodplain management class on Thursday, December 11th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. It is quite long, but it is an all-encompassing class that talks about everything you're going to need to know about the floodplain administrator position. It goes even more in depth than what we did today. So I highly recommend that if you're looking for more information or want to become even more confident in your role, to attend that basic class. All right, lastly here, just got to plug our social media. We do have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter or X. We also have a LinkedIn account. So follow us on any of these here and you'll get notified on training opportunities, any sort of promotional posts that we make. Keep an eye out on those. And that is the end of our end of our content here today. Here is the contact information for the outreach side of our team. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the contact information on the screen here.